July 20, 1944, Normandy, France. At the headquarters of the German 7th Army near Le Mans, a newly appointed senior officer stood over a stack of intelligence summaries, struggling to reconcile what he was reading with everything he thought he knew about modern warfare. Appointed after the death of General Friedrich Dollmann, the SS officer temporarily overseeing the situation found the reports increasingly difficult to dismiss as exaggeration or Allied deception. More than 6 weeks had passed since the Allied landings in Normandy. By all established standards of German military theory, the American advance should have slowed dramatically under the strain of supply shortages. Instead, the opposite appeared to be happening. US forces were not merely maintaining momentum, they were being sustained at a level that directly contradicted core principles of Wehrmacht logistics. In the margins of one briefing document, the officer scrawled a note that would later be discovered in captured German files. The Americans are operating mobile bakeries roughly 15 kilometers behind the front. Either this is deliberate misinformation, or they possess a logistical system we fundamentally fail to understand. Signals intelligence and frontline observation reports painted an even stranger picture. Despite being locked in brutal close-range fighting among the hedgerows of Normandy, American units were consistently supplied not only with ammunition and fuel, but also with freshly prepared meals, newly baked bread, regular mail deliveries from home, and according to one particularly hard-to-believe account, sweet pastries handed out by women wearing Red Cross uniforms. That report, improbable as it sounded, was accurate. On July 16, just 4 days earlier, the first Red Cross Clubmobile units had come ashore in France. These specially outfitted trucks, staffed by American female volunteers, were designed to serve coffee, snacks, and donuts to combat troops. To German planners, the idea that such vehicles had been given priority shipping space across the Atlantic bordered on the absurd. From the German perspective, shaped by years of brutal austerity on the Eastern Front, this appeared to be a catastrophic misuse of resources. The Wehrmacht had deliberately stripped away nearly every non-essential comfort from its soldiers in pursuit of operational efficiency. Allocating transport capacity to morale rather than weapons or fuel seemed like proof of Allied frivolity. What German commanders failed to grasp at that moment was that they were not observing excess or softness. They were seeing American industrial capacity translated directly into military practice. The ability to deliver comfort items to troops under combat conditions was not separate from battlefield power, it was a visible symptom of it. An army capable of distributing donuts within artillery range was, by definition, an army capable of sustaining overwhelming firepower indefinitely. German confidence in American logistical vulnerability was not new. Since 1940, Wehrmacht intelligence agencies had closely examined U.S. military doctrine, and their conclusions were consistently dismissive. Analysts within the Foreign Armies West Division repeatedly emphasized what they saw as America's dependence on material abundance, framing it as a strategic weakness rather than a strength. Captured American planning documents seemed to reinforce this belief. Papers recovered from a downed U.S. glider during the Sicily campaign indicated that American forces required approximately 45 kilograms of supplies per soldier per day. In contrast, German units operated on rations ranging from just over 9 kilograms during periods of inactivity to around 20 kilograms in sustained operations. Veteran German officers, many of whom had endured extreme deprivation on the Eastern Front, interpreted these figures as evidence of indulgence and fragility. To them, an army that demanded so much support could not possibly endure prolonged hardship. This mindset was widely shared at the highest levels of command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, articulated this prevailing attitude during a staff conference in May 1944. As recalled after the war by his Chief of Staff, General Gunther Blumentritt, Rundstedt remarked bluntly that American forces required nearly 3 times the supply tonnage of their German counterparts. What Rundstedt and others could not yet see was that this imbalance did not signal weakness. It marked the arrival of a new model of warfare, one in which industrial scale, logistical reach, and morale management were as decisive as tactics or bravery. By the summer of 1944, that model was already reshaping the outcome of the war in Western Europe. Many German military thinkers entered the Second World War convinced that victory depended less on factories and stockpiles than on human resolve. In their view, material abundance created weakness, while determination forged strength. The experience of the Eastern Front seemed to confirm this belief. In Russia, German commanders argued sheer willpower had repeatedly compensated for shortages. From this perspective, modern supply systems were fragile constructions that would disintegrate once exposed to the chaos of real combat. This belief was not merely a slogan repeated for morale. It was deeply embedded in German operational doctrine. The Wehrmacht emphasized flexibility over rigidity, initiative over instruction, and simplicity over abundance. Officers were trained to act independently when communications failed. Soldiers were expected to survive with minimal logistical support, forage when necessary, and continue fighting even when isolated. Dependence on continuous resupply was seen as a dangerous vulnerability. From this mindset, American military planning appeared not only excessive but foolish. German analysts viewed the Allied insistence on transporting items such as chocolate, cigarettes, stationery, and other non-essential comforts as evidence of cultural softness. To them, it reinforced propaganda claims that democratic societies could not endure prolonged hardship. German logistics officers ran the numbers and concluded that the American invasion plan violated every known principle of military feasibility. Captured German records later revealed that Major Heinrich von Stillnagel, serving on the logistics staff of Army Group B, had presented a detailed assessment before the invasion. His calculations showed that sustaining 12 Allied divisions landing directly onto open beaches would require approximately 8,400 tons of supplies every single day. No army in recorded history, he argued, had ever delivered even half that amount without secure port facilities. Attempting such a feat while under constant enemy fire was, in his words, beyond mathematical possibility. What German intelligence failed to comprehend was the unprecedented scale of Allied preparation. For nearly 2 years before the invasion, the United States had been systematically converting Britain into a vast forward operating base. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later described the island as a single, enormous military installation. By early June 1944, Allied forces had accumulated roughly 2.5 million tons of equipment, fuel, ammunition, and provisions. The volume was so immense that it could have filled a continuous freight train stretching from London to Edinburgh and then back again. The armada that departed on June 6th was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Nearly 7,000 vessels took part, ranging from massive warships to more than 4,000 specialized landing craft. Yet the true surprise lay not in the sheer numbers, but in the ingenuity embedded within the fleet. Allied planners had anticipated problems the Germans never imagined and had engineered solutions in advance. Among the landing ships were LST's landing ships, tanks that had been converted into floating support facilities. Some housed fully equipped kitchens with industrial ovens capable of producing fresh bread while still at sea. Others were outfitted with refrigeration systems designed to preserve perishable food during the Channel crossing. According to U.S. Navy documentation, LST-357 maintained internal temperatures of 32 degrees Fahrenheit throughout its voyage. LST-491 carried an entire mobile bakery unit that could be deployed and functioning within hours of reaching shore. These adaptations were not improvised responses to battlefield conditions. They were the result of deliberate planning and resource allocation choices that German doctrine would have dismissed as wasteful indulgence. When German E-boat patrols encountered the invasion convoys, they struggled to interpret what they were seeing. In his war diary, Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Hoffmann, commander of E-boat flotilla S-130, recorded his confusion. He noted the presence of unfamiliar vessels resembling modified merchant ships, painted naval gray, emitting smoke similar to industrial factory ships, with no clear military function. By late June 1944, reality had shattered German assumptions. On D+20, American logistics operations had achieved what German planners had deemed impossible. Despite continuous fighting and the absence of a major port, Allied forces were unloading an average of 15,000 tons of supplies per day across the Normandy beaches. To put this into perspective, the entire German Army Group B in France was receiving only about 8,000 tons per week. Quartermaster Corps records reveal the extent of this logistical success. Mobile bakeries were operating at both Omaha and Utah beaches, each producing approximately 60,000 loaves of bread daily. This was not the dry, hard bread substitutes familiar to German troops, but fresh white and whole wheat loaves baked overnight and delivered warm to frontline units every morning. German intelligence officers struggled to reconcile these observations with their understanding of warfare. Reports captured from the headquarters of the 352nd Infantry Division include a memorandum dated June 28 from intelligence officer Hedemann Franz Gaulick. He described American soldiers at forward positions receiving individually packaged meals containing canned meat, vegetables, crackers, sweets, and cigarettes. Each ration, he noted, offered more variety than German troops had experienced in months. He expressed disbelief that partially eaten meals were being discarded items his own soldiers would have considered celebratory fare. The pace at which the Americans established their supply network defied all previous German experience. By June 30th, Allied forces had landed over 71,000 vehicles and nearly 450,000 tons of supplies. 97 separate supply depots were already functioning within the beachhead. For comparison, the German invasion of Norway in 1940, conducted through captured ports and against minimal resistance, had taken 3 weeks to achieve similar logistical throughput. Normandy demonstrated a fundamental truth the German High Command had underestimated. Modern war was no longer decided solely by endurance or courage. It was increasingly shaped by industrial capacity, logistical foresight, and the ability to sustain combat power at scale. What German doctrine dismissed as excess proved to be the foundation of Allied success. German planners entered the summer of 1944 with deep skepticism about American logistical ingenuity. This doubt extended even to one of the most ambitious Allied concepts, the construction of temporary artificial ports, later known as the Mulberry Harbors. Although German intelligence units had detected unusual maritime components taking shape in British ports identified through repeated aerial reconnaissance flights, the overall assessment within the German Navy dismissed their significance. On May 20th, Admiral Friedrich Ruge, serving as naval advisor to Army Group B, briefed senior commanders on the possibility that the Allies were attempting to create movable port facilities. In his post-war recollections, Ruge acknowledged that while such a concept might be feasible in theory, he believed it to be severely constrained in practice. The harsh conditions of the Atlantic, combined with the powerful tides of the English Channel, were expected to limit any temporary harbor to negligible effectiveness. German estimates concluded that even under ideal circumstances, such structures would be capable of handling no more than 1,000 tons of cargo per day. Reality unfolded very differently. By June 18th, less than 2 weeks after the Normandy landings, the American-built Mulberry A harbor off Omaha Beach was fully operational. Initial throughput immediately reached approximately 3,000 tons per day and soon escalated to nearly 7,000 tons daily, 7 times higher than the most optimistic German projections. The scale of the project was unprecedented. The harbor was assembled from roughly 600,000 tons of prefabricated concrete caissons, supported by 180,000 tons of steel. Floating roadways extended from anchored ships directly to the shore, rising and falling with the tides. These improvised highways enabled the continuous movement of supplies and could accommodate up to 2,000 vehicles every single day. German observers stationed along the coast struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division operating near the British Mulberry B site, later described the scene in his memoirs. Through binoculars, his men watched what appeared to be an entire harbor emerging from open water. Cargo ships unloaded directly onto floating platforms, trucks rolled ashore without interruption, and tidal movement posed no obstacle. Within days, the Allies had established port facilities that rivaled and in some cases surpassed permanent French harbors that had taken decades to develop. The psychological effect on German leadership was immediate and profound. The Mulberry harbors were not merely a logistical success. They were a demonstration of industrial and engineering supremacy. For German commanders, the implication was unsettling. If the Americans could fabricate fully functional ports from nothing, the limits of their capabilities were no longer clear. A different but equally damaging blow to German morale arrived less than a month later. On July 16, 1944, an event occurred that German officers would later describe as uniquely demoralizing. The first American Red Cross clubmobile landed on French soil at Utah Beach. The vehicle, nicknamed Daniel Boone, began serving freshly prepared donuts and hot coffee to frontline soldiers within hours of arrival. Initial German intelligence reports dismissed claims of women operating mobile refreshment units near combat zones as either enemy propaganda or evidence of reckless American leadership. Friedrich von Mellenthin, an intelligence officer with Panzer Group West, wrote in his July 20th assessment that reports of American women near the front were likely fabricated or indicative of command incompetence that endangered civilians. The reports, however, were entirely accurate. Within a week, 12 clubmobiles were active throughout Normandy. Built on modified GMC trucks, each vehicle was equipped with donut-making machinery, large coffee boilers, and serving counters. These mobile units were capable of producing up to 2,000 donuts and 500 gallons of coffee per day. Staffed by 3 women per vehicle, the crews routinely operated within range of German artillery, closely following advancing combat units. Captured American correspondence revealed how deeply this affected troop morale and how bewildering it was to German analysts. One letter, written by Private James Morrison of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division on July 22nd and later recovered after the fighting near St. Lo, described the scene in vivid detail. Morrison wrote to his mother that he had just been served fresh donuts and real coffee by American women, as if he were back home at a neighborhood cafe. The front line was only a few miles away. German shells were falling on nearby roads, yet the women laughed, joked, and served food as though attending a church gathering. By late August 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Paris, German logistical officers confronted a reality they could not reconcile with their own doctrine. According to decades of experience most recently reinforced on the Eastern Front, mechanized formations were believed incapable of sustaining operations more than 200 miles from established supply bases without a prolonged pause. Fuel consumption alone should have forced any rapidly advancing force to halt. Yet the American Third Army under General George S. Patton defied every such calculation. On August 24th, General Heinrich Eberbach submitted an assessment to the German High Command, preserved in captured archives. He reported that American spearhead units were operating approximately 400 miles from their original landing beaches. By all established logistical models, he concluded, the Americans should have been compelled to stop within 48 hours to regroup and resupply. Their fuel usage far exceeded what German analysts believed could be delivered under battlefield conditions. The halt never came. For German commanders, the conclusion was unavoidable. American logistics were operating according to principles and capabilities that Germany neither anticipated nor understood. Within a day of the Allied breakout from Normandy, German reconnaissance units began submitting reports that made little sense to their commanders. Along roads marked for one-way traffic only, convoys of American trucks flowed without interruption. Day and night, engines never seemed to stop. To German observers trained in traditional supply theory, what they were seeing defied precedent. This was the opening phase of what the Allies called the Red Ball Express, and it would permanently alter how modern warfare understood logistics. The scale of the operation quickly exceeded anything German staff officers believed possible. According to Allied transportation records later examined after the war, nearly 6,000 trucks were placed into constant motion, crewed by approximately 23,000 drivers. At its peak, reached on August 29, the system was delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day to advancing combat units. The figures alone challenged long-held assumptions about how far and how fast an army could be sustained. These vehicles operated on a vast loop stretching roughly 700 miles round trip. Drivers were rotated like relay runners. One man would hand the truck over to another without the vehicle ever stopping. Maintenance crews performed repairs while engines were still warm, sometimes while the trucks were already back on the road. Sleep was a luxury. Most drivers averaged no more than 4 hours of rest per day, yet the flow of cargo never slowed. One detail stands out with particular historical significance. Nearly 3/4 of the drivers were African American soldiers assigned to segregated trucking units under the U.S. Army's racial policies of the time. Despite systemic discrimination, these men became the backbone of the Allied advance. German logisticians studying captured data repeatedly underestimated them, an error that proved costly. German doctrine had long been rooted in mathematical models refined during years of continental warfare. Supply officers relied on carefully calculated tables that defined strict operational limits. A single mechanized division, German planners estimated, required 300 tons of supplies per day during combat and 100 tons when stationary. Transport efficiency dropped sharply with distance by their calculations. Capacity declined by 30% for every 100 kilometers from a supply base. Beyond 300 kilometers, sustained offensive action was considered impossible. The American Army ignored those equations and succeeded anyway. By September 1944, Allied forces were receiving as much as 20,000 tons of supplies per day, even while operating over 500 kilometers inland from the Normandy beaches. A single U.S. armored division was consuming 750 tons daily and still receiving everything it needed. The USOS First Army alone was burning through 800,000 gallons of gasoline each day, more fuel than the entire German Western Front was officially allocated in a week. One German commander, Major General Fritz Bolling, who led the remnants of a panzer formation, later expressed his frustration in a private letter to his wife, recovered after his capture. "We are no longer fighting men," he wrote. "We are fighting a factory. They do not beat us tactically, they bury us under material." As if the truck convoys were not enough, German intelligence began receiving reports that seemed absurd even by Allied standards. Engineers claimed the Americans were constructing fuel pipelines directly from the English coast to the front lines. The project, later known as Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, sounded like fantasy to officers accustomed to horse-drawn fuel wagons and vulnerable rail depots. A German engineering officer, Major Hans Klein, who had overseen fuel infrastructure across occupied Europe, submitted a formal analysis to the High Command on September 10, a document later captured intact. He pointed out that pipeline construction normally required specialized steel, precision machine joints, and pumping stations spaced every 30 kilometers. According to American claims, however, prefabricated sections were being laid at a rate of 50 kilometers per day, nearly 10 times faster than Germany's best-ever performance. Yet the unbelievable became reality. The first Platz line went live on September 22, initially pumping 56,000 gallons of fuel per day into the port of Cherbourg. By October, with multiple lines functioning, daily delivery reached 300,000 gallons. By March 1945, the system achieved its intended capacity, 1 million gallons per day, enough to exceed the total fuel consumption of entire German army groups. The psychological effect on German defenders was severe. One of Germany's most respected operational commanders, Hermann Balck, later stated during post-war interrogation, "When we learned the Americans were feeding their tanks directly from England, we understood the war could not be won. Geography had ceased to exist for them." Perhaps the most striking demonstration of Allied logistical dominance came not during combat, but on Thanksgiving Day, 1944. With American forces spread from the Netherlands to the Swiss border, the Quartermaster Corps attempted something no army had ever tried. On the same day, they served a traditional Thanksgiving meal to nearly 2 million soldiers across Europe. Frozen turkeys, cranberries, and all the trimmings arrived on time everywhere. Ironically, German intelligence interpreted this as a deception. General Hasso von Manteuffel, preparing the Ardennes offensive, reviewed reports on November 20 suggesting enormous shipments of frozen turkeys moving toward American units. His intelligence staff concluded the operation must be masking preparations for a major attack. They were wrong. The turkeys were real, and so was the industrial force behind them. What happened was not trickery, nor was it intended as a display of power. It was logistics, quiet, methodical, and overwhelming. In mid-October 1944, a U.S. cargo vessel left New York Harbor carrying an unusual payload for an active war zone, over 1,600 tons of frozen turkeys. After crossing the Atlantic, the ship reached its European destination in mid-November. It was only the beginning. Follow-up shipments delivered everything needed for a traditional Thanksgiving meal: cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and other familiar foods. From the ports, a carefully coordinated network of refrigerated trains and trucks ensured that nothing spoiled on its journey to the front. By November 23, 1944, American soldiers dug into foxholes along the Siegfried Line were eating a full holiday dinner. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie were served only miles from enemy positions. Even units experiencing intermittent German artillery fire received hot meals. One infantry division holding exposed defensive ground near Aachen was issued complete Thanksgiving dinners despite ongoing shelling. The effect on morale was immediate and profound. The impact on the enemy, though unintended, proved equally powerful. In the days following the holiday, captured American troops were questioned by German intelligence officers. Again and again, the soldiers mentioned the Thanksgiving meal. What seemed like a harmless detail became an accidental revelation. The United States could move vast quantities of perishable goods across an ocean and deliver them intact to troops under fire. For German interrogators already strained by shortages, the implication was deeply unsettling. That winter would become one of the harshest in decades. The winter of 1944-45 was the coldest Europe had seen in half a century. German commanders, recalling how their own armies had collapsed in the Soviet Union under similar conditions, believed the weather would finally blunt the American advance. In fact, the Ardennes offensive was partly based on the assumption that US forces would struggle to equip exposed troops with proper winter gear. The reality was the opposite. In an emergency logistical surge, American supply services delivered nearly 2 million complete winter clothing sets in just 3 weeks. These shipments included equipment unfamiliar to German forces: layered clothing systems designed for extreme cold, insulated footwear with removable felt liners, sleeping bags rated for temperatures well below zero, and compact stoves that allowed small units to generate heat and cook food in the field. German reports captured later that winter revealed growing alarm. One Corps commander noted in December 1944 that American troops in Bastogne continued receiving supplies by air despite being completely surrounded. The air-dropped containers included ammunition, medical equipment, winter clothing, and even mail from home. In contrast, German units drawing from their own supply depots often lacked gloves, boots, or adequate coats. The Bastogne resupply operation became a defining demonstration of American logistical flexibility. Over the course of 8 days, transport aircraft delivered nearly 1,500 tons of supplies to the encircled 101st Airborne Division. Parachutes were color-coded so ground troops could instantly identify their contents: red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for winter clothing. The scale and precision of the operation exceeded anything the German airborne supply system could accomplish across the entire Western Front. By March 1945, the wall reached the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. German military doctrine, shaped by their own experiences in 1940, assumed that a crossing of this magnitude would require weeks of preparation. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans would need at least 3 weeks to stockpile bridging equipment and supplies. German commanders believed this delay would provide a critical window to rebuild shattered defenses. That assumption collapsed in a matter of days. On March 7, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. Within 24 hours, American engineers had stabilized the damaged structure and were moving approximately 1,000 vehicles per hour across the river. But Remagen was not an isolated success, it was only the opening act. Over the next 10 days, U.S. engineer units constructed 62 bridges across the Rhine. On average, a new crossing became operational every 4 hours. One of the most remarkable, a floating treadway bridge stretching more than 1,100 feet near Oppenheim, was completed and opened to traffic in just 10 hours. These were not fragile, improvised structures. They were fully engineered crossings capable of supporting 70-ton tank transporters. Each bridge was organized as a self-contained system, complete with traffic control, repair crews, and anti-aircraft defenses. Redundancy was built into every plan. If one bridge was damaged or destroyed, others were already absorbing its load. A German engineer officer who witnessed the crossings later summarized the experience bluntly: "The Americans did not so much overcome the Rhine as ignore it. They laid bridges across it with a speed and confidence that made resistance feel pointless. Where one crossing failed, two more were already in use." By the final months of the war, the lesson was unmistakable. American victory in Western Europe was not driven solely by firepower or numbers. It was powered by an industrial and logistical system that could deliver food, clothing, fuel, and steel anywhere in any weather faster than the enemy could comprehend. By the time Europe reached Victory Day on May 8, 1945, the scale of American logistical performance had surpassed anything previously imagined in warfare. What the United States achieved was not simply efficient supply. It was a transformation of how wars could be fought and sustained. Across all theaters of war, not limited to Europe, American transportation and quartermaster units successfully moved an unprecedented volume of material. Verified transatlantic deliveries alone accounted for 46.7 million measurement tons of supplies, alongside 1.37 million vehicles shipped overseas. These figures reflect confirmed records, not inflated wartime claims. Some commonly repeated myths do not withstand scrutiny. The total number of jerry cans delivered, for instance, was approximately 21 million, not the exaggerated figures of 140 million sometimes cited. Likewise, production of the iconic GMC 2.5-ton truck reached 570,000 units, not 800,000, as is often claimed. The consumption side of this system was equally staggering. American forces distributed 2.4 billion individual ration packs, 800 million packs of cigarettes, and 500 million candy bars. Ammunition production and delivery reached 11 billion rounds. By March 1945, monthly supply usage had climbed to extraordinary levels: 1.2 million tons of material, 50 million gallons of fuel, and during major offensives, 8,000 tons of ammunition consumed every single day. These numbers were more than logistical trivia. They represented a profound shift in the nature of modern conflict. The German Wehrmacht, long admired for its operational skill and battlefield maneuvering, discovered that tactical excellence alone was insufficient when confronted by an enemy capable of sustaining overwhelming material superiority without interruption. After the war, this realization was openly acknowledged by German commanders during extensive interrogations conducted by the U.S. Army Historical Division. These records remain among the most reliable sources for understanding how Germany perceived American power. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, widely regarded as one of Germany's most capable leaders, stated during his 1947 interrogation that American supply capabilities exceeded German estimates by a factor of 5 to 10. Defensive planning, he explained, had been built on the assumption that U.S. forces would face material constraints that simply never existed. In the German army, a division operating at half supply was still considered fit for combat. American units, by contrast, typically refused to launch major operations unless they had stockpiles equal to twice their expected needs. Perhaps the most revealing insight came from Heinz Guderian, architect of blitzkrieg warfare. In his post-war reflections, he drew a clear distinction between the strengths of the opposing sides. Germany, he wrote, revolutionized tactics, speed, coordination, and decisive maneuver. The Americans introduced something even more decisive: the capacity to continue fighting indefinitely through relentless logistical support. Germany could win engagements. The United States could sustain entire armies. History, he concluded, made clear which advantage proved decisive. Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, offered an even deeper conceptual critique while working with American historians after the war. He observed that Germany viewed logistics as a subordinate function meant to support operations already planned. The Americans reversed that logic. In their system, operations existed largely to enable the continuous flow of supplies. They did not merely defeat the German army, Holder argued they smothered it under sheer abundance. This assessment was not confined to Europe. Japanese military leaders reached strikingly similar conclusions. Long before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto famously warned that Japan might dominate the conflict for 6 months, after which American industrial power would become unstoppable. That prediction was later confirmed by Japan's own senior leadership. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, noted that Japanese planners closely examined American island-hopping campaigns in search of tactical vulnerabilities. None were found because tactics were not the decisive factor. The Americans constructed supply networks that delivered more resources thousands of miles from home than Japan could move a few dozen miles from its own shores. By the time battles were fought, the outcome had already been determined in factories, shipyards, and cargo holds. The consistency of these conclusions across both European and Pacific theaters highlights the universal nature of America's logistical revolution. Whether advancing through the hedgerows of France or across remote Pacific atolls, U.S. forces maintained a level of material superiority that redefined what sustained warfare could look like. This success did not stem from a single dramatic innovation, but from a collection of practical choices that became revolutionary when combined. Standardization was central. American vehicles were built with interchangeable parts. A truck damaged in Italy could be repaired using components shipped to France. German forces, by contrast, relied on a patchwork of vehicles captured from across Europe, each with incompatible parts and maintenance requirements. Mechanization further widened the gap. Germany continued to depend on approximately 750,000 horses for transport, animals that require vast amounts of food, around 20,000 tons of fodder each month. The American Army eliminated this burden entirely by relying almost exclusively on motorized transport, increasing speed while removing an entire logistical category. Through these methods, unremarkable on their own but transformative together, the United States reshaped the relationship between industry, supply, and combat. Victory was no longer determined solely by battlefield brilliance, but by the ability to deliver overwhelming resources endlessly and everywhere. American victory in the Second World War was shaped not only by battlefield tactics, but by a logistical system unlike anything the world had previously seen. Long before Allied soldiers reached Europe, the United States had already solved a problem that crippled every other major army: how to move fresh food, medicine, fuel, and equipment across oceans without degradation. The U.S. military pioneered large-scale refrigeration for warfare. From factories in North America to combat units thousands of miles away, uninterrupted cold chains were maintained. Fresh meat arrived unfrozen and edible, blood plasma remained viable, and temperature-sensitive medicines reached frontline hospitals in conditions no other army could replicate. German logistics, by contrast, relied on preservation methods and transport systems that routinely failed under distance and pressure. Communication was equally transformative. American engineers installed tens of thousands of meters of telephone lines across liberated France, allowing supply officers to coordinate deliveries in real time. Orders, adjustments, and emergency requests could be transmitted instantly. German forces still depended heavily on motorcycle messengers and written dispatches, often losing days between request and response time that modern mechanized warfare did not allow. Another decisive advantage was specialization. The American military abandoned the idea of universal transport vehicles and instead designed machines for specific logistical tasks. Refrigerated trucks carried food, tanker vehicles delivered fuel, and mobile workshops repaired equipment close to the front. German units, constrained by doctrine and production limits, used the same vehicles for nearly every purpose. The result was inefficiency, higher breakdown rates, and reduced operational tempo. One of the most underestimated pillars of American logistical dominance was the integration of women into military operations. While Nazi ideology restricted women to narrowly defined civilian roles, the United States mobilized female manpower at an unprecedented scale. Over 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps (WAC), with thousands directly embedded in logistical command structures. WAC personnel operated communications hubs that synchronized supply movements across entire theaters of war. They managed depot inventories, tracked millions of individual items using punch card systems, and processed shipping manifests at ports handling vast volumes of materiel. For German officers accustomed to exclusively male military bureaucracies, encountering women efficiently running these operations was both unfamiliar and unsettling. Lieutenant Colonel Elna Hilliard, who commanded WAC units in the European theatre, supervised more personnel than many German regimental commanders. In her post-war assessment, she documented that WAC members were responsible for processing approximately 40% of all supply documentation across the European front. This organizational decision freed tens of thousands of male soldiers for combat roles while simultaneously improving accuracy and speed through specialized training. By fully mobilizing its population, the United States effectively doubled its military efficiency, leveraging resources that Germany had excluded for ideological reasons. The result was not only operational superiority but a profound psychological effect on the enemy. For German soldiers who had not tasted chocolate since the early years of the war, the scent of American rations drifting across prisoner compounds was demoralizing. Wehrmacht units surviving on bread diluted with sawdust listened as American troops complained about repetitive meals that were still richer and more varied than anything German soldiers had seen in years. Captured correspondence reveals how deeply this disparity affected morale. In December 1944, infantryman Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife from a bunker later destroyed in combat. He noted that American prisoners of war were better fed than active German soldiers, casually discarding half-eaten chocolate bars and using slices of white bread for cleaning weapons. "We are not fighting an army," he wrote, "we are fighting the entire wealth of America." Senior German officers recognized the consequences. General Hans Schmitz later testified that while his men fought with determination, their will collapsed when they learned that American forces received steady mail, medical supplies, and even ice cream, while German units lacked ammunition and basic care. No amount of discipline, he concluded, could sustain morale against such imbalance. This realization shaped post-war thinking. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, German officers were not surprised. They had already witnessed America's ability to move limitless resources across continents. A nation capable of supplying armies over oceans could logically rebuild a shattered Europe. General Lucius Clay, military governor of the U.S. Occupation Zone, actively recruited former German logistics officers to assist with reconstruction. Their familiarity with American systems proved essential. Colonel Hans von Griffenberg, formerly Chief of Staff to Army Group Center, later remarked that the same principles, standardization, mechanization, communication, and deliberate abundance, were applied to peace exactly as they had been applied to war. The Marshall Plan, in effect, was wartime logistics redirected towards civilian recovery. This pattern repeated itself during the Korean War. Although American forces initially struggled tactically in 1950, their logistical engine quickly regained momentum. Within months, supply flows stabilized and expanded. Former Wehrmacht officers serving as NATO advisors observed familiar dynamics. One remarked that the United States delivered more material to the port of Busan in 3 months than Germany had managed to send to Stalingrad in 2 years. General Adolf Husinger, former German operations chief and later chairman of NATO's military committee, summarized the lesson succinctly. Modern wars are decided not by isolated victories but by sustained supply dominance. Battles may be won temporarily, but wars belong to those who can continuously feed, fuel, and equip their forces. The influence of American wartime logistics extended far beyond the battlefield. In the 1960 seconds, Harvard Business School began formally studying U.S. military supply systems from World War II as the foundation of modern supply chain management. Scholars traced direct connections between military innovations and civilian practices such as containerized shipping, just-in-time delivery, computerized inventory control, and total quality management. The Normandy landings did more than liberate Western Europe. they quietly launched the logistics revolution that reshaped global commerce. Techniques developed to supply soldiers under fire later powered international trade, industrial efficiency, and long-term economic dominance. World War II logistics did not end with victory. They became the blueprint for the modern world. When the United States began supplying its allies during the Second World War, the scale of what it delivered stunned even experienced military leaders. The Soviet Union alone received roughly 500,000 vehicles more than it could manufacture on its own during the same period. Yet the sheer number of trucks, jeeps, and transport vehicles was not what truly impressed Soviet commanders. What left a lasting mark was the method behind their arrival. American supply chains functioned with a level of accuracy that Soviet planners struggled to match even within their own territory. Equipment left factories in distant ports such as Vladivostok and arrived deep inside the Soviet heartland with remarkable consistency. In comparison, moving supplies from Moscow to Stalingrad often proved slower and less reliable. Marshal Ivan Konev captured this reality candidly in private letters. He argued that any future conflict with the United States would not be decided by battlefield maneuvers alone. The real adversary would be American industry itself. According to him, the United States possessed the ability to move enormous quantities of material across the globe faster than the Soviet Union could supply its own frontiers. This was not merely an advantage in arms or manpower, it represented a fundamentally different level of industrial power. This logistical dominance was not accidental. During the war, the United States faced an unprecedented challenge, managing and coordinating supplies on a scale never before attempted. To meet this demand, the military turned to punch card data systems, many of them operated by members of the Women's Army Corps. These operations collectively formed the largest information processing effort the world had yet seen. IBM machines became the nervous system of the American war effort. They recorded, categorized, and tracked millions of individual items as they moved from factories to ports, from ports to depots, and finally to soldiers at the front. Ammunition, medical supplies, uniforms, and rations were not merely shipped, they were logged, counted, and monitored continuously. This logistical necessity accelerated the development of large-scale computing and laid the groundwork for post-war business technology. Thomas Watson Jr., later president of IBM and himself a former Army Air Forces officer, would later reflect that modern computing emerged not from academic theory but from military need. The demand to control vast flows of supplies created both the technology and the market for information systems. In his words, the origins of the information age could be traced back to wartime supply depots. The transformation becomes even clearer when comparing logistical performance across campaigns. During Germany's invasion of France in 1940, the Wehrmacht managed to move an average of about 3,000 tons of supplies per day, relying heavily on established rail networks. Despite initial success and access to captured French stockpiles, German forces encountered severe supply shortages within 3 weeks. Much of their logistics still depended on horse-drawn transport, which advanced little more than a dozen miles per day. 4 years later, the American-led landings in Normandy revealed a completely different model. Without functioning ports and operating directly from open beaches, Allied forces sustained an average daily flow of approximately 15,000 tons of supplies. Instead of declining, this volume increased steadily for months. Motorized convoys covered hundreds of miles daily, maintaining a tempo that German forces were unable to disrupt or match. This combination of vastly greater volume and dramatically faster delivery produced an operational rhythm that reshaped the battlefield. It allowed Allied commanders to sustain continuous pressure and adapt plans rapidly, something the German command structure could not replicate. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often skeptical of American battlefield tactics, ultimately offered one of the strongest endorsements of their logistical approach. In his memoirs, he concluded that American supply capabilities mattered more than any experimental weapon developed by Germany. Because the United States could support virtually any operation it chose, it enjoyed strategic freedom. Other nations, by contrast, were forced to design campaigns around what they could realistically supply. Winston Churchill expressed this idea with his usual flair. He observed that modern warfare had revealed a new hierarchy of power. Factories now outweighed fortifications, and supply routes mattered more than front lines. The true legacy of the American war effort, he suggested, was not measured in captured territory but in the ability to deliver abundance under constant threat. Even Charles de Gaulle, a staunch defender of French military prestige, acknowledged this reality. He argued that the Americans did not prevail through exceptional brilliance in command, but through unmatched logistical strength. While tactics could be studied and copied, recreating such industrial depth was far more difficult. The logistical system built by the United States during the Second World War permanently altered the nature of warfare. From that point forward, every major military power faced the same dilemma: either develop comparable supply capabilities or accept long-term strategic disadvantage. In the modern era, the capacity to move, manage, and sustain resources has become as decisive as any weapon carried by a soldier. Modern American wars have repeatedly revealed a constant pattern that first became unmistakable during the Second World War. From the deserts of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Afghanistan and the cities of Iraq, US, forces often encountered serious battlefield difficulties. Yet again and again, those tactical problems failed to alter the final outcome. The decisive factor was not brilliance in maneuver or innovation in weapons, but something more fundamental: overwhelming logistical dominance. When the United States deployed more than 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Storm, those forces were supplied more reliably than the Iraqi army operating inside its own national borders. This was not a new doctrine of warfare, nor a radical reinvention. It was the continuation and refinement of a system first proven on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. Decades later, when American soldiers stationed at isolated Afghan outposts received full Thanksgiving meals in 2001, they were unknowingly benefiting from logistical methods developed during the Allied invasion of Europe. A symbolic moment reflecting this reality occurred on March 7, 1984, 40 years after the capture of the Remagen Bridge. On that anniversary, American and German veterans gathered at the site where history had once pivoted. Among them stood former German Major General Rudolf Langhauser, who had been responsible for defending the bridge, and former U.S. Army Captain George Gibbs, whose unit had been among the first to seize it. Langhauser, then 75 years old, offered a candid reflection that stunned many in attendance. He explained that German planners had anticipated American tanks, artillery, and air power. What they had failed to foresee was the sheer scale of American supply capacity. According to Langhauser, defeat came not when U.S. time. Troops crossed the Rhine, but earlier, when it became clear that American forces could sustain abundance while German units struggled to provide basic medical supplies. An army capable of delivering luxuries to the front while its enemy lacked bandages, he concluded, could not be overcome through conventional warfare. Captain Gibbs, 73 at the time, replied with characteristic simplicity. He remarked that any soldier expected to risk his life deserved, at the very least, to be properly fed. Experience had shown, he added, that well-nourished troops performed far better than hungry ones. The two former adversaries then shook hands, united by a shared understanding that extended beyond nationality or ideology. Their exchange captured a broader historical truth. In the age of industrial warfare, control of supply chains equals control of outcomes. American success did not stem from inventing revolutionary combat tactics, but from mastering the science of delivery. The United States did not merely change how wars were fought, it transformed how large-scale competition itself functioned. The scope of the American logistical effort in Europe during World War II is best understood through verified figures that pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered possible. Over 500,000 GMC 2.5-ton trucks were produced and deployed. 21 million jerrycans were shipped across the Atlantic. Approximately 160,000 railway cars were transported or constructed, alongside the delivery of 2,000 locomotives. Engineers assembled 62 Rhine bridges in just 10 days. By September 1944, daily supply throughput peaked at 20,000 tons, Over the course of the campaign, total delivered cargo reached 46.7 million measurement tons. Fuel pipelines pumped 172 million gallons directly to advancing forces. 100,000 miles of telephone wire were laid to maintain communication. Soldiers received an astonishing 2.5 billion pieces of mail. Behind these numbers stood the human infrastructure that made them possible. 2 million troops were supplied without interruption. 500,000 vehicles were kept operational. 23,000 drivers powered the Red Bull Express day and night. 150,000 members of the Women's Army Corps sustained the logistical backbone through planning, administration, and coordination. Together, these achievements defined a new reality of warfare. Victory was no longer determined solely by courage at the front or brilliance at headquarters. It was decided by the ability to move, feed, fuel, repair, and sustain an army faster and more completely than any opponent. In that domain, American logistics did not merely support victory, it made victory inevitable. By 1944, nearly 3 out of every 4 American truck drivers in the European theater were African American. That figure was not merely a demographic detail. It was a window into a far larger transformation. These men were the visible operators of a system that redefined how modern wars were fought. What unfolded was not simply a military campaign, but the full mechanization of conflict itself. German officers traditionally understood war as a sequence of battles, with supply units working quietly in the background to keep operations moving. American planners, however, approached the problem from the opposite direction. For them, the movement, storage, and delivery of resources was not a secondary concern, it was the central mission. Combat existed to protect and enable logistics, not the other way around. This shift in perspective proved more influential than any single weapon, formation, or battlefield maneuver. In 1944, many German commanders openly mocked what they saw as excessive American dependence on fuel, food, vehicles, and infrastructure. Yet, within a year, those same logistical networks were not only sustaining advancing armies, but laying the groundwork for Europe's recovery. The very system that had powered destruction across the continent soon redirected its capacity toward rebuilding cities, feeding populations, and restarting economies through what would become the Marshall Plan. Efficiency and devastation was matched by generosity and reconstruction. What began as ridicule gradually transformed into astonishment, then admiration, and ultimately imitation. The intellectual lineage that had shaped the German military from Clausewitz and Moltke to Schlieffen and Guderian arrived at one of its most profound realizations only after defeat. Industrial-era warfare had exposed a new reality. Battles no longer determined supply lines determined battles. The Wehrmacht entered the Second World War convinced that logistics existed to serve operational brilliance. Experience proved otherwise, and often brutally so. Campaigns did not drive supply systems forward. Instead, military actions merely followed the reach of fuel, food, ammunition, and transport. The American advantage did not lie in superior marksmanship or daring tactics. It lay in calories, gasoline, spare parts, and tires. Victory came not from clever maneuvers, but from relentless delivery. Trucks, not tanks, became the decisive instruments. Warehouses mattered as much as headquarters. Schedules rivaled strategies in importance. As one senior German officer later reflected, the contrast was stark. German planners asked how to win the next engagement, while Americans asked how to keep an army functioning tomorrow, next week, and next month. One side obsessed over operations, the other mastered processes. History rendered its verdict without ambiguity. Those who dismissed American logistical thinking in 1943 would, by 1945, become its most persuasive witnesses. Hard-earned experience had taught them an unforgiving lesson of modern conflict. In the age of industrial warfare, logistics is not a supporting element of power. It is power. Everything else, strategy, tactics, heroism, flows downstream from supply. And in the end, the story of victory is not written only in battles fought, but in systems that never stopped moving.